Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning in Manhattan. The sun is just breaking through the skyline, casting long shadows across a glass-walled executive office on the 47th floor. Inside, 23 employees are scattered across their desks, typing away, sipping coffee, living their normal, predictable corporate lives. Then, without warning, a sound cuts through the air. Sharp, violent, unmistakable. A slap. Not the kind you hear in movies. The kind that makes your stomach drop. The kind that freezes time. And in that single moment, everything changes. Because the man who threw that slap was Richard Callaway, a billionaire CEO worth over $3 billion. A man who built empires. A man who shook hands with presidents. A man whose face smiled from magazine covers with headlines like "The New American Dream." And the man he slapped? A 62-year-old driver named Thomas Gray. A man who earned $38,000 a year. A man who drove the same black sedan for 11 years. A man who never raised his voice. A man who, until that very moment, was invisible to everyone in that office. But what happened next didn't just destroy Richard Callaway's reputation. It didn't just spark a media firestorm. It exposed a secret so devastating, so buried in lies and silence, that powerful people spent decades making sure it would never see the light of day. And the truth? The truth was standing right there in that office, trembling, with a red mark on his face, holding a secret that would unravel everything. So let me ask you something. Why would a billionaire, a man who had everything to lose, slap his driver in front of witnesses? Why would he risk his empire, his legacy, his carefully crafted image, over a man most people in that building didn't even know the name of? And here's the part that haunts me. Why didn't Thomas fight back? He just stood there, calm, almost like he expected it, like he'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. Within minutes, the CEO of the company, Linda Harmon, walked into that office. She saw the scene. She saw Richard's face, pale and shaking. She saw Thomas, still standing, still silent. And according to 3 separate sources who were there that day, Linda turned to Richard and said one sentence that made him collapse into his chair. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Now, before we go any further, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My mom said I can't hit 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Subscribe, and let's prove her wrong. Because what I'm about to tell you next is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about power, family, and the lies we tell to survive. Let's rewind. Let's go back to where this story really begins. Not in that office. Not on that Tuesday morning, but decades earlier, in 2 completely different worlds that should never have collided. Richard Callaway was born in 1961. In a small town outside of Pittsburgh, his father worked in a steel mill. His mother cleaned houses. By the time Richard was 19, he'd already started his first business, a small construction company that he built with a $5,000 loan and an unshakable belief that he was destined for more. And he was right. By 30, he owned 4 companies. By 40, he was a multimillionaire. By 50, he was a billionaire. Forbes called him a genius. Harvard invited him to speak. Politicians sought his endorsement. But there was a gap in his story, a missing chapter. Between 1979 and 1983, Richard Callaway disappeared from public record. No business filings, No addresses, no interviews, just silence. When reporters asked about those years, he'd smile and say he was finding himself. But the truth? The truth was buried in a small apartment in Detroit, where a 20-year-old woman named Diane Porter lived alone, struggling to make rent, working double shifts at a diner, and raising a baby boy she named Thomas. Thomas Gray grew up in that same Detroit neighborhood where his mother worked herself to exhaustion just to keep the lights on. He never knew his father. His mother never spoke about him. All she ever said was, "Some men aren't meant to stay." Thomas learned early that survival meant keeping your head down, working hard, and never expecting anything from anyone. He dropped out of high school at 16 to help pay bills. He worked construction, landscaping, delivery jobs, anything that paid cash. By the time he was 25, he'd saved enough to get his commercial driver's license. And that's how, in 2001, he ended up working for a private transportation company in New York City. Quiet, dependable, invisible. For 11 years, Thomas drove for the same client, Richard Calloway. Every morning at 6:45, Thomas would pull up to Richard's penthouse in Tribeca. Every evening at 7:30, he'd drop him off. They barely spoke. Richard spent most of the ride on phone calls, reviewing documents, making decisions that moved millions of dollars. Thomas spent most of the ride watching the city pass by, listening to classic rock on low volume, and thinking about his mother back in Detroit, who was now in her 70s and struggling with diabetes. But Thomas noticed things. He noticed when Richard's hands shook before board meetings. He noticed when Richard would stare out the window, silent, like he was remembering something painful. And he noticed the envelope, the one Richard kept in his briefcase, the one with a Detroit postmark from 1983. Thomas had seen it once by accident when Richard left his briefcase open. He didn't read it, but he saw the name on the return address, Diane Porter, his mother. Now let's talk about the day everything fell apart. October 17th, 2012. Richard Calloway was under pressure. A lawsuit from a former business partner was gaining traction. The board was questioning a merger deal. The press was starting to dig into his past. That morning, Richard was on edge. Thomas could feel it the moment he got into the car. Richard didn't say good morning. He didn't acknowledge Thomas at all. He just sat there, jaw clenched, scrolling through his phone with the intensity of a man about to lose everything. When they arrived at the office, Richard got out without a word. But then he stopped. He turned back, and he said, "Come upstairs with me. I need to talk to you." Thomas hesitated. In 11 years, Richard had never asked him to come upstairs, but he followed. They took the elevator to the 47th floor. They walked past cubicles, past conference rooms, past employees who glanced up briefly and then went back to their screens. They entered Richard's office, floor-to-ceiling windows. Manhattan skyline stretched out like a kingdom. Richard closed the door. He stood behind his desk, hands on his hips, breathing hard. Then he said, "I know who you are." Thomas didn't move. Richard continued, "I know who your mother is. I know why you took this job. I know what you want." Thomas, calm as ever, said, "I don't want anything from you." Richard slammed his hand on the desk. "Don't lie to me. You've been driving me around for 11 years, watching, waiting, planning. You think I don't know? You think I'm stupid?" Thomas's voice didn't rise. He just said, "I took this job because I needed work. That's all." Richard stepped closer. His face was red. His voice was shaking. You're here to destroy me. You're here to expose me, to take what I built, to ruin everything. And that's when Thomas said the sentence that changed everything. He said, I'm here because my mother told me, before she died, that you were my father, and I wanted to see for myself what kind of man walks away from his own child. Silence. The kind that crushes your chest. The kind where you can hear your own heartbeat. And then Richard Calloway, billionaire, raised his hand and slapped Thomas Gray across the face. The sound echoed. 23 employees outside the office stopped typing. Heads turned. Through the glass walls, they saw it. They saw Thomas's head snap to the side. They saw Richard's hand still raised, trembling. They saw Thomas, standing perfectly still, his cheek red, his eyes locked on Richard's. But Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't even touch his face. He just looked at Richard and said quietly, You're hitting the wrong man for the wrong reason. Then he turned and walked out. Through the office, past the stairs, past the whispers, into the elevator. And he never came back. Within 10 minutes, Linda Harmon, the CEO, stormed into Richard's office. She didn't knock. She just stood there, arms crossed, and said, What did you just do? Richard was sitting in his chair, head in his hands. He didn't answer. Linda said it again, louder. What did you just do, Richard? And Richard, voice cracking, said, I made a mistake. Linda's face went cold. You just assaulted an employee in front of witnesses. You know what that means? Lawsuits, media, investigations, everything you built, gone. And for what? What did he do? Richard looked up at her, tears in his eyes, and said, He's my son. Within hours, the story started leaking. Not to the press, not yet. But inside the company, whispers spread like wildfire. Did you hear? The driver. Richard hit him. Why? No one knows. HR was notified. Legal was called in. Security footage was reviewed. And Richard Calloway, for the first time in his career, had no control over the narrative. Meanwhile, Thomas Gray disappeared. He didn't answer his phone. He didn't return to his apartment. Friends said he packed a bag and left the city. Some thought he was planning a lawsuit. Others thought he was running. But the truth was, Thomas didn't want money. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted the truth to come out. The company tried damage control. Lawyers contacted Thomas, offering settlements, NDAs, anything to keep him quiet. But Thomas refused. He told them, I'm not interested in your money. I'm interested in the truth. And that's when the investigation started. Not by the police. By a private investigator named Ellen Cross. Hired by a coalition of former employees who suspected Richard Calloway had been hiding more than just a missing son. Ellen started digging. She found old hospital records, birth certificates, bank transfers from 1983, letters between Richard and Diane Porter. And then she found something that changed everything. A DNA test, ordered by Diane Porter in 1998. Results confirmed. Thomas Gray was Richard Calloway's biological son. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Ellen discovered that Richard knew. He'd known since 1998. Diane had sent him the results, along with a letter begging him to acknowledge Thomas, to help support him, to be a father. Richard never responded. He buried the letter. He buried the truth. And he built his empire on top of it. Now let me ask you something. If you were Thomas, and you discovered that your father knew about you for over a decade, and chose to ignore you, how would you feel? Would you forgive him? Would you want revenge? Or would you just want him to admit the truth? Comment below. I want to know what you think. Because what Thomas did next shocked everyone. 6 months later, Thomas Gray walked into a courtroom in Manhattan, not to sue for money, but to sue for recognition. He filed a paternity acknowledgement case, demanding that Richard Calloway publicly acknowledge him as his son. The media exploded. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire's secret son exposed." Driver reveals decades-old cover-up. Richard Calloway's hidden past comes to light. Richard's lawyers fought hard. They argued that the statute of limitations had passed. They argued that Thomas had no legal standing. They tried to discredit him, to paint him as a gold digger, a liar, someone trying to exploit a wealthy man. But Ellen Cross had the evidence, the DNA test, the letters, the bank records showing that Richard had sent money to Diane Porter for 2 years before cutting her off completely. And then, in a moment that silenced the entire courtroom, Thomas took the stand. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just told his story. He talked about growing up without a father, about watching his mother work 3 jobs, about the day she told him, on her deathbed, "Your father's name is Richard Calloway. I wanted you to know, not because I want you to hate him, but because you deserve to know the truth." The judge asked Thomas, "What do you want from this case?" Thomas looked directly at Richard, who was sitting across the courtroom, pale and broken, and said, "I want him to say it. I want him to admit that I exist, that I'm his son. That's all I've ever wanted." And then, in a moment no one expected, Richard Calloway stood up. His lawyers tried to stop him, but he walked to the front of the courtroom. He looked at Thomas, and he said, "You are my son. I abandoned you. I abandoned your mother. I was young, and I was scared, and I made a choice that I've regretted every single day of my life. I don't expect you to forgive me, but you deserve to hear me say it. I'm sorry." The courtroom was silent. Journalists scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. And Thomas, for the first time since that day in the office, cried, not because he was angry, but because after 62 years, he finally had what he needed, the truth. But here's the part that surprised everyone. Thomas refused the settlement. Richard's lawyers offered him $10 million to sign an NDA and walk away. Thomas said no. He told the press, "This was never about money. This was about being seen, about being acknowledged. And now that I have that, I don't need anything else from him." Richard Calloway resigned from his position as CEO 3 months later. His board forced him out. His reputation was destroyed. Charity organizations removed his name from buildings. Forbes pulled him from their list of most admired business leaders. He sold most of his companies and moved to a quiet estate in upstate New York. Some say he's trying to make amends. Others say he's just hiding. As for Thomas, he went back to work, not as a driver. He started a small nonprofit in Detroit, helping single mothers get access to childcare and job training. He lives modestly. He doesn't do interviews. He doesn't chase fame. He just lives his life, quietly, on his own terms. And when reporters ask him if he's forgiven his father, he always says the same thing. Forgiveness isn't something you give because someone deserves it. It's something you give because you deserve peace. My mom said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers before today ends. Let's prove her wrong. So let me ask you, do you think Richard Calloway deserved forgiveness? Or do you think some things are unforgivable? What would you do if you were in Thomas's position? Would you take the money? Would you walk away? Or would you fight for the truth, no matter the cost? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story made you think, if it made you feel something, hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves real stories, where nothing is ever as it seems. And if you're still here, watching this, comment, "I'm still here," because I want to know you made it to the end. Hit that subscribe button. If you haven't already, let's prove my mom wrong today. And our next story, it's going to leave you absolutely speechless. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Thank you for watching. And remember, the truth always finds a way. Always.